1870s, the labor movement was making its voice heard. The workers were being exploited with long hours, barely making enough to survive. There was no compensation for being injured on the job or even death. Now enter the organizations of labor and the radical ideas of socialism and anarchy. One of the main targets of the labor movement was the railroads. Railroads were the arteries that kept the lifeblood of the U.S. economy pumping. Goods and people were moved all across the country to all points of the compass. You cripple the railroads and you strangle the U.S. economy. Now, the first major event was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. In the latter part of July of 1877, the Great Strike shut down the entire railroad system in the United States, starting on the East Coast in Boston and New York, then down to Baltimore and then Pittsburgh. The strike quickly moved west. Within days, the strike had reached Chicago, the center of the country's railroads. Everything went through Chicago. Then, on July 24th, 1877, violent confrontations began in Chicago. Strikers, railroad workers, and what we would call today labor organizers effectively stopped the shipment of freight throughout the country. The strike spread to the stockyards, construction jobs, manufacturing plants, and other businesses. Everything in Chicago was shut down. The sides were drawn up. The National Guard was called out. Chicago's Mayor Heath requested President Hayes to send in 6 companies of infantry, which he did. Now, the companies were arming their loyal employees. Volunteers were being sworn in as police officers. There were mass arrests of protesters and socialist leaders. The confrontation between business and labor were bloody. By the end of the strike, hundreds had been killed and thousands of federal troops and other armed militia occupied the city. Now, this can be considered the beginnings of the labor management conflict in America. The next important event in the labor movement concerns a gentleman by the name of Terence Vincent Powderly. He was born in 1849, died in 1924. Now, he was an attorney, a Republican politician, and a labor leader. Powderly was elected the Grand Master of Workmen for the Knights of Labor. He would serve in that position from 1879 to 1893. Now, the Knights of Labor were a nationwide labor union that looked out for the working man. This is unless you belong to certain groups. 5 groups of workers who were barred from the KOL were bankers, land speculators, lawyers, liquor dealers, and gamblers. Who thought gamblers were a job? Okay, all other workers were okay, such as low-skilled workers, railroad workers, migrants, and steel workers. As one of the largest labor organizations in the 19th century, the rapid growth of the large-scale factories and industries made it possible for the KOL to boast an enrollment of 1 million workers by 1886. Now, Powderly and the KOL wanted an 8-hour workday, cooperative ownership of business. Employees own and operate their business. However, Powderly supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. He believed non-European immigrants took away jobs from native-born Americans and drove down wages. So he was okay with white European immigrants taking away jobs from native-born Americans. I don't know. Powderly increased union membership, though, from 28,000 members when he took over to over 800,000 by 1886. Now, the union began its precipitous slide into oblivion in 1886 when it went after the Union Pacific and Missouri Pacific Railroads. These were controlled by Jay Gould in what is known as the Great Southwestern Railroad Strike. Now, the strike lasted from March 1st to May 4th, 1886. The strike spread over 5 states: Arkansas, Illinois, Kansas, Missouri, Texas, and within the first 5 days, 200,000 workers were on strike. By the 10th day, violence broke out. Strike breakers were beaten, acts of sabotage, assaulting and disabling moving trains, threatening notes and visits to working engineers, and arson fires in the yards. A favorite tactic of the railroad workers was to let steam locomotives go cold, forcing the railroad to spend up to 6 hours slowly reheating those engines for use. The railroad owners were not sitting idly by wringing their hands, though. Enter Jay Gould, an unscrupulous, ruthless railroad magnate. He was not a man to be messed with. When he was scammed by a Mr. Gordon, he had him arrested, But the courts granted bail and Mr. Gordon took off for Canada. Smart move. Canadian government refused to extradite Gordon, so Gould and a compatriot took matters in their own hands, went into Canada and kidnapped Mr. Gordon. Before Gould could get back across the border, he was arrested along with his partner in Canada on kidnapping charges. They were held without bail. This infuriated the U.S. He was finally released on bail to avoid a war with Canada. So Gould, using violence as the excuse, requested military assistance from the governors of the affected states. As the violence would spread, public opinion turned against the workers. The strike was officially called off on May 4th. The cost of the strike in human lives was 9 dead. 7 of those killed were the KOL members. Now, the failure of the Southwestern Railroad strike was a major defeat sustained by the Knights of Labor. When the strike did not draw the support of the engineers and the other industrial workers, internal conflict broke out between the various factions. The failure of the Southwestern Railroad strike was a major defeat sustained by the Knights of Labor. When the strike did not draw the support of the engineers and other industrial workers, internal conflict broke out between the various factions within the Knights, paralyzing the Union and causing its demise. Interestingly, though, on the very day the strike ended, the Haymarket massacre took place. On April 30th, 1886, an estimated 25,000 workers walked off their jobs in protest for an 8-hour workday at the same rate of pay they were receiving for their 10-hour day. A large rally was held on May 4th at Haymarket Square in Chicago. Everything was fine until the police started to disperse the crowds. It was at this point that a bomb was thrown at the police. The explosion and gunfire that erupted caused the death of 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians. Dozens of others were hurt. The expected response of the killings was inevitable. The police cracked down on labor organizations and known anarchist groups. What was likely using tactics that would not pass constitutional scrutiny today. Now, the trial of the Haymarket 8 goes far beyond the scope of this video. Needless to say, the Haymarket 8 were sentenced to death. I have put the link to a few websites about this event in the description below if you're interested to find out what happened to them. Now, the next major labor event was the Pullman strike of 1894 and Eugene v. Debs. To understand the strike, you first need to understand the concept of a factory or company town. Now, the concept is very simple. The company owns all the housing, all the stores in the town. They have their own police force to enforce the laws. The workers rent the homes, buy the goods in the company store, and have their rent and purchases deducted from their weekly pay. Now, George Mortimer Pullman was an engineer who designed and manufactured the famous Pullman sleeping cars, as you see up here. He built a town around his factory, hence the term factory town, obviously. Now, this is where his employees could live in relatively clean and safe environment, away from those labor agitators. It featured housing, shopping areas, church, theaters, parks, hotels, and libraries for his factory employees. There were over 1,300 structures in this town. Everything was going fine until the economy went into the tank. You see, Pullman expected his town to make a profit. He ruled his town as if he were a medieval lord. He decided what could and could not be done in his town. Some examples of his rules were no independent newspapers, no public speeches, no town meetings or open discussion. His inspectors regularly entered the homes to inspect for cleanliness and could terminate workers' leases on a 10-day notice. Now, during the financial panic of 1893, George Pullman had reduced wages by 20 to 30% because of falling sales. However, he didn't cut the rent or lower prices at his company stores, nor would he give any cost of living adjustment. At this time, a man by the name of Eugene Debs stepped onto the stage. Debs brought in the American Railways Union, the ARU organizers, to Pullman and signed up many of the disgruntled factory workers. When the Pullman Company refused to recognize the ARU or any of the negotiations, the ARU called a strike against the factory. But it showed no sign of success. To win the strike, Debs decided to stop the movement of Pullman cars on railroads The over-the-rail Pullman employees, such as conductors and porters, they didn't go along with the strike. Deb called a massive boycott against all trains that carried Pullman cars. It affected most train lines west of Detroit, and its peak involved some 250,000 workers in 27 states. Now, the American Federation of Labor opposed the boycott because the ARU was trying to take their members. The Railroad Brotherhood of Conductors and Engineers were opposed to the boycott. Now, the Firemen's Brotherhood was split on it. Those last two unions were skilled labor, so they really didn't want to get involved. Now, the General Managers Association was on the opposite side of the railroad. They organized opposition to Debs and the ARU. 30 people were killed in riots in Chicago. Another 40 were killed in other states. Property damage went north of $80 million. Now, when the strike interfered with federal mail cars, the federal government became involved and used troops. Again, it's impossible to go into depth on all the events of this strike due to the time constraints. The end result of the strike was the public turned against the strikers, and Debs was arrested for conspiracy to obstruct the mail, a federal offense, and violating a federal injunction ordering them to stop interfering with the trains that carried the mail. Now, he was acquitted on the conspiracy charge, but served 6 months on violating a federal injunction. Now remember, these videos are basic overviews to help you understand the importance of events in U.S. history. These videos are not an in-depth analysis of these events. That would be impossible in 10 minutes. Anyways, in my next video, I will discuss immigration and civil rights during the industrialization of America. Now guys, remember, take notes in class, review those notes every day for about 5 to 10 minutes. Now, if you've been doing this and watching these videos, you should do okay on your tests. Okay, now if you like this video and you want to see more 5 to 10 minute videos on American history, hit the like button, ring the bell, and please subscribe to my channel to get notified when I post new content. Thank you.